Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today's guest is Regan Arntz-Gray. Regan Arntz-Gray is the writer of a Substack that focuses on feminism, in particular how to address a lot of cultural issues surrounding gender inequality. And she is also the co-host of the podcast titled Moral Mayhem, where she talks about a lot of similar issues related to culture, especially gender. I've been kind of fascinated by her work because she talks a lot about very uncomfortable issues related to gender and the society that men and women grow up in. And I think that these types of conversations are very important to have. She identifies as a feminist, but in the present day, feminism is very diffuse. Different people have different definitions and different interpretations of feminism. Her interpretation of feminism specifically is more positive sum. She tries a lot to reach out to the types of people, especially men, who may have been a little bit more apprehensive towards what we might call like the mainstream contemporary feminism or the pop culture idea of feminism. Basically, this pop culture idea of feminism may have driven some men away because of its portrayal of gender inequality and its portrayal of cultural issues that may have been a bit more anti-men or a bit misandrist, frankly. And I think she does a good job of acknowledging that while still presenting some compelling argument for the ways that feminism can be helpful in modern society for both men and women. So we talk a lot about that. We talk about the cultural differences between men and women. For example, she brings up the whole idea that like women and girls specifically have grown up in a society where they are socialized and trained to please other people or please men, for example, and how that often gets women and girls into sticky situations that we should often be more cognizant of. So we talk about stuff like that, and we talk a lot about the difficulty of addressing a lot of issues related to sexual assault, which I think is also an incredibly important topic to discuss. And we talk about much, much more. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Regan Arntz-Gray, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess I'm going to start with, you wrote a recent Substack article about feminism where you ended it with one quote that I thought was kind of striking, so I'm going to quote it now. Quote, "I do think feminism needs to do a better job of talking to men and addressing their issues. That belief was one of the reasons I started this blog. So how can I do better?" End quote. Yeah, so could you like walk me through your thought process of like why you originally started your Substack blog and like some of the things that you hope to achieve or some of the conversations that you hope that other people will have with you?
For sure. So there's a couple of things. So one is that I've been struggling with the concept of feminism a lot recently because it's just such a broad term. And this is evidenced by the fact that you can always find feminists very, very, very strongly disagreeing with one another on a whole range of questions. And you see different sort of strands or types of feminism that come into the mainstream at various points in time. I think that when it comes to non-feminists' view of feminism, whether they're male or female, but especially for men, they're often being exposed to feminism through some sort of diffuse channels, some sort of like pop culture memes and things that they are putting together into this very vague understanding of what is feminism and what is associated with that. And it's often not something that they'll link back to any specific feminists or individual thinkers, and rather to like slogans or points in time or, you know, things that were said during Me Too, etc.
Yeah, or like when people had shirts that said the future is female, like that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that especially, and I know you talked about this on another interview recently, but, you know, especially in the post-Me Too world, I do think that there was sort of a collective acceptance of misandry that has become normalized. And that has become...
And there was also like a denial that there was a collective acceptance of misandry.
Right. That too. Right. Because even bring, one of this guy, Connor Jennings on Substack wrote about an experience where, just the experience of not being able to say anything when women say all men are trash or whatever for fear of being called fragile in some way, right? Like, oh, you can't even handle, you're already privileged and you can't even handle criticism and things like this. So I think that there's one part of it, which is that a sort of essentialized view of men that is misandrous has become understood to be identical to feminism for a bunch of people. That's one thing. Another is that the mainstream sort of feminist thought nowadays, I think, is actually very social constructionist and does not believe that sex differences are at all based in biology. And there's a whole bunch of beliefs along these lines, which I think have made feminism not seen as a universalist movement when it actually did come from a more universalist place. So I'm responding to people like Brian Kaplan and other people like that who talk about feminism in this way and think that it's, at this point, very negative. And sometimes the evidence for that is, well, we can't easily say that things are overall worse off for women than they are for men. And therefore, feminism doesn't make sense because if you don't have that belief, then what are you talking about? Why are you representing women as a special interest group? So I think that, when it comes to the fairness concept, if you wanted to, the idea of men and women being treated equally badly doesn't seem like a very good goal. Because, if you start off saying women are oppressed, you could easily just oppress men and then be like, okay, now everybody's fair, so we've accomplished the goal. That's obviously not accomplishing anything.
Yeah, it would be like if every single person in the country was doing really poorly, but they were all equal. Technically, you've solved income inequality, but you've done so by making the situation worse.
Exactly. And so I think that there is a significant group that feels that is what feminism is about, is trying to cut down men. It sees everything as very zero-sum, where I don't feel that improving gender relations and reducing sexism is zero-sum generally. I think most of the time, men and women benefit from less intensely strict gender roles, more flexibility for the individual, etc. It may be true that in previous historical periods, having stricter or more rigid gender roles was helpful for various reasons when we had a society that required more division of labor and where men and women's roles really were quite different and needed to be. But in the kind of modern era where in a lot of cases, men and women are doing very similar things in the world, I do think that loosening those gender norms is positive. Now, that doesn't mean that you go and pretend sex doesn't exist at all. That's the mistake that I think is being made. But I do think giving room for individual expression is one of the things that feminism has been very positive for. But I do agree with other people you've had on about the idea that women have gotten more of that flexibility right now than men have. So you can even see this in just how people dress, what kind of stories people are attracted to, etc., where there is a push for there to be a broader understanding of what women can be like and what being a woman means. And there's not necessarily the same degree to that for the male side. So when I'm saying how can feminism talk more or do better with respect to representing men's issues or speaking to men, I think on the one hand, we need to be more clear about punishing instances of misandry and very clearly saying that is not part of the feminist movement that I believe in. In fact, it's promoting sexism and it's promoting essentializing people on the basis of sex, which is something that at least to early and first and second wave feminists is not consistent with the core principles. But also that the part where I struggle, though, is that the kinds of feminist analyses are often not very popular with men, though the ones that apply to men are not very popular with men. So somebody on Substack that I follow recently wrote something about feminism, and one of the examples he gave of why it doesn't seem to be true
wait,
that
sorry,
feminists...
what's the Substacker's name?
Oh yeah, this is Bentham's Bulldog. He's a college student, but he's a great Substack. It's fun, analytical philosophy guy. But he had a piece that was going through why he thinks that feminists do not live up to the claim that they are focused on gender equality. And one of the examples given was around the Me Too movement and the sort of phrase "believe all women," as prioritizing women's views on the basis of their sex, and also failing to recognize or have the same degree of concern for men who are victims of sexual assault. And I totally understand why somebody would have that impression. And I don't think that it's a false impression. We did see a lot of really extreme hashtags and things like that. But on the other hand, when you think about, if you're going to say something like, feminists don't care enough about sexual assault, my question is, relative to whom? Because who does care about male sexual assault? Is it straight men that are really worried about it and talking about it? Generally not. In fact, they're telling feminists to stop trying to feminize their spaces and things like that when feminists try to do that. And so I think there's a tough position here where there's a lot to talk about how gender roles can be harmful to men, and some of that could come from feminist theory. But the people who are most concerned about the way that gender roles harm men are not necessarily interested in hearing it from feminists. And I struggle with that. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, there's so many different strands. I don't even know where to start. How about this? Let's flip the page. Give me one simple question that I can use to extrapolate, based on everything that you just said.
Yes. So let's go into the prison rape, male sexual assault topic. Okay. Yeah. So, I've seen people say the Me Too movement made them feel that, they were not concerned about the potential for men to be falsely accused, and they're also not sufficiently concerned about male victims. Okay. I get what you're saying, but who is it that actually, historically, men had no protections legally from sexual assault, more or less. Rape was generally defined to be, around penetration of a woman, and it was all very gendered. And it's feminists who even created the activism which led to men being protected legally from sexual assault. So while on the one hand, I can see what they're saying, that this pop culture feminism is insufficiently concerned about male sexual assault and, kind of saying this is not your time to speak and all these things. On the other hand, it was actually feminists who protected men or were the only ones who were concerned about this really in the first place. And so, yeah.
All right. So I think you addressed two things. I think I agree with one of those things. And I think the second thing, I don't think you sort of addressed it, but you also didn't dive into the weeds. But my guess is that if we were to dive into the weeds, we might have a little bit of disagreement. Yeah. So you said so you think that one of the the complaints that you might hear from some people about, let's call it mainstream contemporary feminism, is that
which is our word for the bag bubble of pop culture and other things that we've constructed into this sort of what comes to mind when somebody thinks of feminism who's not super into feminism in 2024.
Yeah. The people the people that are not terminally online like us.
Yeah.
All right. So they might say that feminism is insignificantly cognizant of men that are accused of sexual assault and men that that are the victims of sexual assault. And then your response is that feminists have traditionally been very cognizant of male victims of sexual assault. That's your argument. Yeah. So I would agree. I think that feminism is, or at least quote, whatever the hell true feminism is, which at this point I don't even know if that such a thing might exist beyond some academic papers, and even then within those academic papers there's still disagreement. But what let's say that for the sake of the argument that true feminism is sufficiently cognizant of men that are victims of sexual assault. I would say that they probably are, but they are still not cognizant of men that have been falsely accused of committing sexual assault. So that's where I would agree with you, and then either disagree with you or at least focus on something differently than you do. So that's my take. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that on the insufficiently worried about false accusations and Or, some of these accusations, it's not that they're false. It's that what's being defined as assault or harassment is something that I don't think most people would consider assault or harassment. So sometimes we're talking about false accusations, and then we're talking about what should constitute an accusation in the first place. I focus more on the second part, which is, and I think that you can see this from the perspective of how it's bad for men, but you can also see it from the perspective of how it's bad for women, which is the increasingly narrow conception of what is true consent. So historically, men and women have differences which lead to them having different desires with respect to especially short-term sexual relationships.
Yeah, like they tend to have personality differences that the left either thinks should be denied or that we should actively try to socialize people out of. And I think both of those are problematic.
Right, exactly. And I think that even if you don't have toxic masculinity and rape culture and you take all those concepts off the table, you're going to be, it's very likely that for most women who are exploring their sexuality at a young age, they are generally going to be the person who's going to have to slam on the brakes when they want the sexual interaction to stop. That's just a fact of the matter. And I think that when you erase sexual differences and you pretend they don't exist, then any sort of knowledge that, women might have to be willing to be assertive to, stop an ongoing sexual engagement becomes associated with, poor women shouldn't have to do that because this is all a result of bad socialization or something along these lines.
Or they might say that it's a result of rape culture or something.
Right. Or that women are socialized to be too polite and all this stuff. I think there's some truth to that. I think women are, especially historically, I don't know how much this is true of kids being raised right now, are more socialized to want to be likable. And all of these things can be true. But when you're looking at consent, it's what do we want to encourage in women or in people in general? We want to encourage people to be assertive and be able to say what they need and to protect themselves when they want to get out of a situation and all of this stuff. To me, if we tell women, patriarchy's in your head, you're not going to be able to say no when you want to. And so if you go along with something and then regret it later, it's totally not your fault. And in fact, it can be conceived as he assaulted you because he failed to see that you were affirmatively consenting at a sufficiently high level where that level and the way of measuring it is changing at all times, then you're a victim. And I just think that does not help women to deprogram from the type of socialization that feminists are saying they're worried about. If what we want is women to feel more agentic and not to feel that
they feel like they have more agency,
that they have the power to say what they want, even if it's uncomfortable. And I think when you stop expecting women to do that, that only contributes to their socialization that we're talking about as being problematic in the first place. So to me, the feminist line, and this also has to do with other values around how much do you value liberty versus protection and safety and other things like this. So I tend to be very, high on valuing liberty relative to protection and safety. So to me, I think a world where women have a lot of freedom, but they also have to take on responsibility for getting out of situations that they don't want to be in, and or if they don't think they have the power to do that, they have to take the earlier step of saying, I'm just going to avoid situations where I could be in a place where I'm not going to be able to express myself and I'm going to have an experience that I don't want as a result of that. I think that, to me, expecting that of women is the feminist line, because we're treating women as full adults that are able to, that are able to understand themselves and express themselves and are able to handle liberty. And I think when we start to say, women are so socialized that they can't actually speak for themselves and all of this stuff, then you're actually agreeing with a very trad conception of gender where, well, in that case, we do need to have different rules and laws and regulations for women because they're not able to handle freedom.
Yeah, we can't trust them to be willing to externalize their desires.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, going back to the male side of this, which is insufficient concern for false rape accusations, I think that it's true. I think that the level of concern around that was very low. I think that the Dear Colleagues letter under Obama that basically expressed that gender equality on campus implied that you needed to have active steps to reduce sexual assault and harassment. And the result of that was that schools put in place, judicial processes to handle complaints from students, which did not meet any kind of standard of evidence. And, some of these stories are totally ridiculous and had bad results for men that, even the accusation itself was not something that anyone would typically consider to be a real accusation. So there was one example where, there were two people, they were both drinking, doing drugs. The woman at one point thought about leaving the situation, then she reinitiated sexual activity, later reported the student to the school. They got into a disciplinary proceeding. One of the parts of that was that he wasn't allowed to contact her until the end of the proceeding. And then he texted her just to say, I'm so sorry that this went so wrong. I did not intend this to have happened this way. I think there was miscommunication, etc. Because he texted her, he ended up being expelled from campus and wasn't able to graduate on time and all this stuff. He ultimately was cleared as not having done anything wrong. The harm that he faced because he was facing a essentially quasi-judicial system that did not have any of these standards of evidence, etc., was that he was still punished for something that was not even it was punished for nothing, essentially.
Yeah, like you mentioned, one of the previous interviews I did, I think the way that my previous guest would describe it is that it was like he had the sword of Damocles hanging over his head that entire time.
Right, exactly. And, you're having your name smeared and all of this stuff, and it's very traumatic. Now, I often find myself defending both sides of the aisle by saying, everything is reactionary at some level. Why is it that feminists are so why is it that feminists seem to show so little concern for false accusations? Well, part of the reason is that proving a rape to the standards of evidence that we prove every other crime is very, very difficult. And it is true that women's complaints of assault, harassment, rape, etc., were often not able to be criminally charged, or they were not believed. And so I think that one of the things with the Believe All Women slogan, which I think is similar to sort of like the Black Lives Matter pushback, is that, people responded to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter. And, I think you can have lots of problems with Black Lives Matter. I'm not trying to get into that. But the point is
let's only open one can of worms at a time.
We'll only open one can of worms. It's just used as an analogy. But the other side of the aisle would say, hey, it was implicitly saying Black Lives Matter too, right? There was an implicit to there. And I think that with Believe All Women, there's an implicit finally. Believe women finally, for once. Like, after decades and generations of women feeling that they could not report sexual assault stuff, that they would either not be believed or that it would mark them as impure and therefore less marriageable, less respectable, etc. All of that can be true. It still doesn't justify dehumanizing men and not having concern for false accusations of an extremely heinous sort. So that's kind of where I lay on it. I definitely, Me Too, for me and for a lot of people who identified as feminists their whole life, I think was a sort of wake up call to, oh, this has gone a little bit further than where I ever thought it was supposed to, or some of the interpretations of some of those cases to me were markedly anti-feminist. But
that's actually, to you, maybe the mainstream contemporary idea of feminism would still consider those things to be feminist, even if you would consider them to be anti-feminist.
Exactly. And I mean, we go, this goes back so much further. So if you go to the second wave feminist sex wars of the 70s and into the 80s, that was a time where one of the biggest questions that was separating different types of feminists was, do you want sexual liberty, which comes with potential for danger, or do we want to protect women? So, I wrote a lot about statutory rape a few months ago, and the activism that went into making statutory rape laws gender neutral. They eventually were all made gender neutral, but there was a ton of disagreement within sort of feminist circles themselves, where there were the feminists on the one hand who are like, we need to give women liberty. We should not allow, by telling them that they can't have sex with a man their own age, we're giving men liberties that they're not getting. And then on the other hand, women who are saying, if we decriminalize sex between minors, we're exposing young women to sexual danger that they're not prepared to deal with. And we're failing to acknowledge the very real differences between young men and young women in terms of where they're at with respect to sexuality at that age. So these are consistent issues that come up and actually kind of get into something I'm writing about next, which is why feminism maybe doesn't deserve the ism, because it's not actually a worldview in and of itself. It's sort of a position on one axis that matters in a broader worldview. But if you don't know where somebody sits on a bunch of other important axes that relate to how they think about the world, so that could be libertarian, authoritarian, progressive, conservative, etc., you're not going to know that much about what their beliefs and positions are going to be on a range of issues solely from the fact that they promote anti-sexism.
Would you consider yourself as center right? And if so, how does that color your own flavor of feminism?
I guess, yeah, it's so tough to say whether I consider myself center right. I mean, it all depends on your context. So when it comes to, if I'm comparing myself to my female friends in New York who are under 35, I'm super far right. If you're comparing me to the average American, I'm probably pretty centrist. I mean, I think that...
Yeah, or maybe even center left compared to the average American.
Right. And it's on economic issues, I tend to be more on the right, in a non-populist, libertarian type of bias there. And I think that I think it is just largely happenstance that the American right has been identified with libertarianism, and that this economic libertarianism and social conservatism is the right-wing norm in the US, whereas I am socially liberal and economic. I'm liberal on both sides, which to me is a more consistent position, but many people feel that those are opposed, which I find interesting.
I feel like every single time you respond, you open a dozen different can of worms where I've raised which one should I respond to this time?
You're just hearing my disorganized brain, because right before I got on, I was writing about, is feminism a worldview anyway? And what is a worldview? And what are the axes that actually matter when it comes to understanding these disagreements? So I'm thinking through a lot of these issues live, to be honest.
Yeah, if I can capture some of you thinking through these things live and out loud, then I have myself a podcast. Yeah, but okay. So how about let's rewind to something we said a little bit earlier in this podcast, where you were talking about sex and the nature of consent, where you were talking about how women in general, you were encouraging them to be a lot more assertive about their own desires. Could you re-explain some of the potential explanations for where we are in that area, culturally again?
Yes. So a couple of things. One is, let's start with women being socialized to be people pleasers, which is, some people go so far with that line of thinking to say, consent cannot really exist under patriarchy, because your mind is already shaped by these norms where you're expected to please men and all this stuff. One personal example that helped me to realize that this socialization thing might be more true than I thought it was I years ago was with a girlfriend in New York. we were waiting in line to get a sandwich somewhere, and the guys behind us were trying to make conversation with us. We were both in relationships. They, asked if we wanted to sit with them, but I was like, oh, thanks, but no thanks kind of thing. And they were cool with that, and they went away. And my girlfriend turned to me and she was like, oh my God, you're so harsh. How did you have the balls to say that? And I was like, to say thank you, but no thank you in a polite way. Like, and that kind of woke me up to, oh, like in her mind, just saying no thank you is already being offensive to somebody. And so if that's where you're starting out, I can imagine how you get into these tricky consent situations where you're having sex out of politeness, which is something that feminists like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington seem to be very concerned about.
You're talking about the concept of like empty consent, where you're doing it to like please.
Yes, exactly. And I think that does happen. The question is, what kind of message do you want to take away when something like that happens? So if you're a woman who is reflecting on a sexual experience you had that you really wish you hadn't had, but that you did clearly consent to, one way you can reflect on that is you can feel victimized by the man. You can feel that he should have read into something that was going on, that he should have been
like he should have been better at like reading social cues.
Right. You can think all of those things. Those things might be true. And I think that, we probably have improved some of the norms that men have through all this excessive talk around consent, even if it's been too much and too extreme. But the other way you can respond to that is you can think to yourself, what could I do better? And I just think when it comes to empowerment and female empowerment, to me, thinking, what could I do to strengthen my own resolve, to know myself better, to speak more clearly, and to, if I don't feel comfortable speaking clearly in those situations, to avoid them altogether, is a more empowering way to reflect on that sort of an experience.
All right, so I have two can of worms that I could potentially think of opening as a response to your can of worms. So I'm just going to open the first one because like one at a time once again. So I guess the first one is like, the whole thing about how like maybe sometimes women are like socialized to act as people pleasers, so they might engage into a sexual encounter where it's consensual, but they're doing it because like they've been socialized to not be very assertive about their own desires. But maybe like the reverse is this is also something that I sort of brought up in the previous episode. Maybe there's a time where the reverse is also true, where like a woman really wants to have like sex with someone, but they're not socialized to be willing to say that explicitly. So they'd sort of rely on, like, they hope that they can rely on like social cues in order to like have that, like in order to have sex with someone without being willing to say that out loud. But like if both of those two like things are true at the same time, then maybe it's kind of unreasonable to expect a man to be able to read into that.
Yes, I totally agree with that. So I think that these are, you just, and this is what I wrote a piece that was basically, the subtitle was, you have to choose between liberty and safety at some point. And, this is kind of a similar issue where you have to a little bit choose between being willing to be assertive to get out of a situation. If you want to have this like mysterious, no one is saying clearly what's going on consent-wise, then you need to be really assertive if that's the way you want to operate with respect to casual sexual partners. Alternatively, don't have casual sexual partners. That is a very good option for a lot of people. And I think that, because we went so far on the sex positive side, and this is where I think some of these more conservative feminist voices are accurate in direction, even if I don't go all the way to the extreme with them, or if I don't agree with like some of their conclusions. But
so you moderately agree with them, I guess.
I agree with them in terms. I think that, for example, like somebody like Louise Perry, she wrote a book called "The Case Against the Sexual Revolution." The subtitle is "How the Sexual Revolution Harmed Women Relative to Men," or something very similar to that. I don't think she proves that thesis at all. But does she give really good advice and describe an experience of a particular type of woman in a particular type of social milieu? Yes, she does. And I think she gives good advice for that, which is, if you do not have to convince yourself that you like casual sex, you don't have to like it. It's totally fine. In fact, most women don't like it. And so that, I think, like, confusing that baseline. And this is where being honest about sex differences and being honest about this kind of stuff makes these questions a little bit easier to deal with, even if they're not going to give you all the answers. But if you're aware of the differences in sexual drives between men and women, it's a good baseline to have when you're going around and exploring your own sexuality. And I think, like, even when I was growing up, this was just sort of an implicit understanding that maybe is being missed now, where there was an implicit understanding around all the women I knew when we were growing up that men are going to be more sexually aggressive than you, and you're probably going to be the one to have to say no. And so if you're getting into a situation where you're alone with somebody, you're going to have to be able to do that or make sure that you want to do whatever's going on. So I think that can be lost. Now, with respect to what you were saying about not wanting to say things explicitly, I think that this also gets to the difficult position that we're putting men in. So it's essentially asking men to be extremely emotionally intuitive, but also extremely masculine and assertive, but also to respond very, very quickly to minor signs or signals of disinterest.
And those signs and signals might mean like completely different things depending on like who you're talking to.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, it would be one thing if women were just saying, we're consistently saying, yeah, we just want men to pause before things move to the next stage, make sure we're comfortable, try to give space to deal with that. But that's not what most women want. Most women don't want that. Most women are normal humans who want, an immersive sexual experience where things are happening based on intuition. And, the whole point of sex is it's this very embodied physical experience where you don't necessarily want to keep coming back to the cognitive layer and discussing norms. That being said, that kind of way of approaching sex works really well when you're in a relationship with somebody you know and you trust, and there's sort of an understanding there. When you're engaging in a subculture where you're sleeping with new people all the time who you don't know what their norms around sex are and all of this stuff, I think that becomes very, very difficult to do without taking quite a big risk of things going in a direction you don't want to. And so to me, if you are going to engage in, promiscuous subcultures, that is totally fine, but you should probably make sure you are comfortable being assertive before you do that.
Yeah, I'm not even okay. I'll try to stick to like one aspect of your response. Maybe one reasonable extrapolation of the sort of cultural aspect that we're talking to is that maybe there are like women that do prefer some of the more like patriarchal aspects of masculinity in terms of men being a lot more assertive and like making the first move. Where like they might not say that that's what they prefer. They might say that they prefer feminized men when in reality they prefer masculine men. Maybe that's true.
Yeah, I think that one of the terms that I used for this before was sort of this like cafeteria feminism, where you're like deciding which parts of the patriarchy you want to keep and which ones you want to throw away, and doing it in a very self-serving manner that I just don't think is workable. So this could be like, I want men to be in therapy, emotionally available, support my career, not be, be sexually confident, but not pushy, and also want them to pay for dinner, be the earner, make me feel protected and safe, etc. And I'm like, well, that's a lot to ask for. Because the traditional... Yeah,
like you're asking, like you want to have your cake and eat it too and have someone else pay for it.
Exactly. And I think that it's if you're somebody, especially if you're a gender nonconforming woman, where you don't, map on to sort of the typical female personality characteristics, it might make sense for you to, you probably want a man who appreciates that and can deal with that and all of this stuff. But I do think like, yeah, having your cake and eating it too is the right way to say it, where if you want men to continue to fill the role of provider and protector, you have to ask, what are they providing that role for? Because then you need to be providing something in return, right? So if you're both providing similar things and you're meeting each other as a partnership of equals, and who's the provider and who's doing what will depend on your relative skills and where you're at various points in your life. That is one way to do it. Or if you're more traditional and you're like, listen, I want to fill this role, I want somebody to fill this other role, that also seems fair. But I do think you see women that are kind of asking for both sides of the coin. And I just don't think it's possible. And then this is where you get into, you know, the men's, some of these are like incel type complaints, but around women not actually wanting to see like men's real emotional expression and range and this kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but I that is something I've noticed is just like, he's got to make the first move. He's got to do this. He's got to make more money than me, all of this stuff. But also he can't have, you know, he has to think men and women are exactly the same and not expect any traditional feminine qualities from me or whatever. If he thinks he wants me to cook, that's disgusting, but I want him to pay for everything. Like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Maybe when this interview is done, I want to send you like half a dozen different articles that like go under all of these different rabbit holes.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. But we keep throwing around the term patriarchy constantly in our discussion. So I guess I just wanted to ask this question. How do you define patriarchy? Like, what does it mean to you?
Yeah. So patriarchy to me means a value system that implies men should lead and women should support at like the core level. And it does not just mean like patriarchy. I feel like sometimes I see people assume that patriarchy means all men benefit and control all women and all women are suffering and have nothing to do with patriarchy. That's definitely not true. Like, the values that underlie a patriarchal culture are reinforced by members of both genders, of course, because you can't keep them alive if that's not happening. But
wait,
you know, and I don't.
When you said you can't keep them alive if that's not happening, are you saying that like in the past patriarchy was justified?
Whether it was justified. See, this is actually something that I just don't know enough about. Why you would need to remove liberties from women to achieve some kind of social goal. I think that division of labor along gendered lines made a lot of sense for a lot of history. And it makes less sense now because there are fewer roles in society where the physical differences in particular between the genders are extremely clear and important.
And another qualification when you say division of labor roles, you mean that like as it's like division of labor roles like enforced by society as a whole and not like individual families deciding to have that specific allocation.
Well, that's what I'm getting at actually is like, you know, you're always going to have differences in representation of men and women in various parts of the economy, in, you know, different types of social work, whether that's caring for children, you know, building stuff, war, etc. I am not clear on why it was necessary from a societal perspective, to force women into certain roles and to force them out of certain roles. And I think first wave feminism was really not asking for anything other than just remove the restrictions, and we'll still likely have, on average, very different roles, but there are going to be outliers who want to do things that are more traditionally masculine and vice versa. So that's I don't know. I'm sure there's people who have done historical analyses on why it was necessary to restrict women's liberties on the basis of them being women. I understand why you would have very different roles in society. And I think that when, you know, 90% plus of men and women are, you know, essentially living in separate worlds, you can also understand why you would educate them differently and other things. But again, like legally restricting women to not do certain professions or to not be allowed to have a voice in political representation, etc., is harder for me to understand what the additional value of that is above and beyond just, you know, people doing what they're good at, essentially.
So are you saying that like you would have understood you would understand cultural patriarchy, but you wouldn't understand legal patriarchy? Is that what you're saying?
Probably. That's basically like, I think that, maybe it's that you get into these norms because they make sense and then they become codified. But like, when it comes to evidence that we at least come from a patriarchal society, one of the simplest examples is like, who takes whose name when you get married? Well, women take the man's name. Why is that? Who used to be able to, who was allowed to, do certain things and not be allowed to do other things. And, the patriarchal values, it's not like it's a free lunch for men and they're just living high on the hog. It required men to sacrifice a lot for society just to be kind of considered an acceptable person in the community. So that could be hard manual labor, that could be, fighting in wars and all of this kind of stuff. I think that historically, when we had a much bigger weight on things that required physical strength and physical risk-taking, it makes sense that you saw a more extreme division of labor, which endowed men with more relative power at the higher societal level. I also think just the fact of pregnancy and childbirth leaves women very vulnerable for a long period of their life. And we can all recognize that that's extremely valuable work that we need women to do. But you can also see that when you're a young mother, especially when you didn't have control over pregnancy planning, you are just not in a place where you have the ability to be self-sufficient and demand, fair rights all the time. So I do think some of this sex difference stuff is very relevant here to how these norms kind of came into place. But that doesn't mean that men are not also better off by having more flexibility in terms of how they can express themselves and what they can do to be someone of value in the world. I think that, we all have our own, I am somebody who is a very individualistic person. And I think, you can recognize group level norms. The most relevant group level differences are probably sex differences because, we are a sexually reproducing species, and this goes back so deep in our evolutionary past. And it's absurd to assume that reproduction is our most important goal in life. Our bodies are different because of that. And then to assume that somehow evolution made our bodies quite different, but it just didn't affect a single thing in the mind. It didn't affect a single thing about how you think, psychology, goals, drives, etc. That seems to me like a bizarre prior to start with, which is my push against social constructionists. Doesn't mean that we don't use social norms to strengthen existing sex differences, but it does seem like a very strange prior to me to assume that it's all socially constructed.
Yeah, but maybe even if we shouldn't use social norms to like box people in based on statistical sex differences. But I do think that when it comes to the differences that are there is also a problem on the left to essentially assume that either we can socialize those differences out of people, or that I guess this might be another disagreement I have with the left, that at the very most we can do is just quietly tolerate them. I do think that there are a lot of ways in which sex differences can be actively celebrated, and that can be fine.
Yeah, and I think that interestingly, I think especially sort of the girl boss feminism moment, and just some of the not necessarily just girl boss feminism, but actually, let me back up one sec. So there's something I call the paradox of feminist misrepresentation, which is that what kind of women are attracted to feminism, especially in the last couple of decades? Well, actually just in general.
The percentage of women that gravitate to becoming feminist activists.
And the traits that they tend to have. So these women tend to be in some way gender nonconforming women. And that is part of the reason they're attracted to analyzing gender, because they have felt personally restricted by gender norms, which are not a good fit for them. It can also be that they've been victimized by men or other things. But I think that there's a very strong overrepresentation of sort of gender nonconforming women within feminism. So you start out with, all these women who are being attracted to feminism who are differing from women in kind of system, predictable ways. And then they're mostly spending time with other women who are also somewhat gender nonconforming. And then they're thinking to themselves, oh, it's obviously all socialized because all the women I know are not like this. They don't map onto these like norms about how women are versus men are. And, it kind of proves itself. But one thing that I would say is like the idea that men and women, in order to be treated with equal respect, both given like equal rights under the law and politically, that they need to be identical in every way is a terrible, terrible basis for arguing for equality. Because you're going to 100% for sure fail to meet that bar. And if women are arguing, hey, we deserve to be equal because we're exactly like men, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And I actually think it expresses a lot of internalized misogyny, where some of the, women who are gender nonconforming and they're attracted to feminism for that reason, they actually do look down on traditionally feminine traits. They actually do think they're lesser than some sort of traditionally masculine traits. And it's okay to think that on an individual level, but I think that they fail to recognize that by assuming that it's a bad thing that, for example, women on average are more interested in spending time caring for their children when they're young. They have more desire to do that. Some of that might be socialized, but it's very clear that that is the case. Assuming that that means they're victims of some kind of social brainwashing, to me, is actually quite misogynistic, because it's devaluing women's work and women's desires and proclivities.
Yeah. But I guess just to play devil's advocate, maybe the whole thing is that, like, in the past, when patriarchy did run supreme in history, part of, like, a lot of those, like, traditionally feminine traits within women were often denigrated by men and used to justify saying that men were superior to women. So maybe that's part of the reason why present-day feminists often try to do their best to suggest that they're not like that.
Yeah, and they were also playing off the concept of, false consciousness, which is you think you want to be a support to your husband and your family, but you actually have only been socialized into that. That's not actually what you want. You actually want to be an independent person working on your own goals and stuff. And you've convinced yourself that you want this other thing. That sometimes could be true. In terms of men denigrating women for those things, it is really interesting, because when you look at like older writing, the way like sexist men are talking about women is it's making a virtue out of a weakness almost. So it's like especially post-industrial revolution, when women were less involved, upper middle class women were less involved in economic work than they were pre-industrial revolution, where more of the economy was like in the home, and women were working with their husbands in a more, they were doing more kind of like non-child rearing work. You get to this place where it's like women's weakness is held up as a virtue of women, where to me, it was like justifying looking down on women by making the things you look down on them for what makes them a good woman. I don't know if that makes sense, but is
this like the concept of benevolent sexism?
Probably. It's probably that. And it's like, it's one thing to recognize, on average, women are physically weaker than men, and therefore men are going to be more likely to be on the front lines of war and this kind of stuff. It's another to then say, women on average are physically weaker than men, and so women should try to be as weak as possible. That doesn't follow. Like, strength is still just a virtue. It's just a human virtue for everybody. And when you really think about it, like, do you want your wife to be somebody who doesn't know how to do anything and needs to be cared for all the time and blah, blah? I mean, some people do, but then you might want to ask yourself, why don't I want a partner? Why do I want someone that is essentially another child or whatever? But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So, like, the whole thing about how the left oftentimes is not, like, I think that throughout a lot of recent history, they've been insufficiently cognizant of biological differences. And I think sometimes they think that the solution is to like socialize it out of boys or socialize it out of girls. And I think that's also bad. I'm reminded of something that Richard Reeves, the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, said during his TED Talk when he was talking about boys that were struggling in education. One of the pieces of advice that he would give to like caretakers of those boys would be like, be careful not to like even inadvertently judge him against a female standard. Like it's very important that, like, for example, we don't treat like struggling boys like malfunctioning girls that need to be fixed or need to have those traits socialized out of them. And maybe the solution is to take certain aspects that might be found more in boys or might be found more in girls and actually like continue to like celebrate them as they exist, and like celebrate that those are like somewhat unique parts of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on sort of the aggression point. So actually, just going back to socialization in general, one of the things I said before was like, we can recognize that there's biological differences and still believe that whether you think we are, in 2024 or not, that those can also be strengthened through socialization. So you can think that women are more agreeable than men, and then that we also socialize women to be even more agreeable because we've made being agreeable into a virtue for women specifically. That can be true, but then you can also do the opposite. So I think like when it comes to aggression, we very clearly do not strengthen the sex difference. We actually bring the sexes closer together through socialization. So socialization can go like with strengthening biological differences, or it can go to reduce biological differences. In a modern society where very few people need to display physical aggression very often, I think it is a good thing to reduce aggression to some degree. But I would assume someone like Richard Reeves probably believes that you don't want to encourage the antisocial forms of aggression, but you don't want to tell a boy there's something wrong with him or toxic about him for being more aggressive than the average girl. And you want to make sure that he's being provided with outlets for using that aggression in a healthy way and learning how to direct it towards pro-social outcomes, or at least to neutral outcomes.
Yeah, like allowing them to walk around a little bit more when they're in school, or like stand up some from time to time. Yeah.
And I think like we can talk about that, obviously speaking about the gender aspect of that makes a lot of sense. But as we know, while there are average sex differences, there's also huge variation within sex. So this is really like, let's say this affects 70% of boys and 30% of girls. It still affects a lot of girls too. And I think the modern classroom environment is bad for a lot of kids, especially for a lot of boys. And yeah, I think I'm very sympathetic to those sort of things. In terms of like praising values that are gendered, praising traits that are gendered on average. One example that we could lean into more is like the risk-taking behavior. Men are generally more risk-taking. And if you look at places like Silicon Valley, where they really, really value those traits, I think that you could talk about that as like a positive thing that masculinity brings to the table, that, there's some women who do have it as well, but this is an example of a trait that on average men have more than women, and that has, in our modern economy, is able to translate into things that are very pro-social for everybody, even if it also has these like very bad downsides. And I think that the pushback on the whole toxic masculinity frame is probably getting at something like that, which is, it's one thing to recognize, hey, men are more risk-taking, that's why they're more likely to have gambling addictions and all these other things. It's also why they're more likely to be entrepreneurs. And I think that the fair complaint with respect to mainstream contemporary feminism is it's a lot of recognition of the downsides of male typical traits without recognition of the upsides, and assumptions that anytime the products of the upsides of these male specific traits leads to underrepresentation of women in fields or areas that are powerful or economically well rewarded, implies that there's discrimination, but it doesn't on the downside. So women are not typically, you don't typically hear people saying men are being socialized to end up in prison, or that we should have, we should judge men differently when they commit crimes because they've been socialized in this way and they have these, maybe biological, maybe social, norms that have caused them to behave in this way, and therefore we can't hold them to the same legal standard as women. People would think that's ridiculous. Yet when it comes to the consent thing, people have no problem saying, hey, women are more agreeable. They've been socialized to be more agreeable. Therefore, we have to take their consent in a different, we have to take that into account when we're analyzing some kind of questionable consent situation.
All right, I guess here's where I'm going to play devil's advocate with you from a different angle. So like you're saying that we aren't cognizant of the ways that we socialize men to like commit crimes and get into prison. But I think a lot of like left-wing advocacy, which does often overlap with feminism, is to like improve recidivism rates and is to deal with things like crime through rehabilitation and through like working through the culture that would help prevent men from being socialized to want to do things like commit crimes. And maybe that is one area where it is good to socialize them out of being aggressive. And maybe that is one area where the left is doing so successfully.
No, it definitely is a good thing. Like we have always needed to and should continue to socialize men out of antisocial aggressive behavior. The amount of aggression that you're going to normalize in your society depends on how violent your society is. And when you like read accounts of certain like Native American tribal societies which were engaged in a lot of warfare, you'll find that like the games that the boys played tend to be like increasingly brutal, dependent on how brutal the men are going to have to be as members of that society. So that's one just flag to put here is like, when we're talking about what's socialized or not, we have to remember we don't actually have a baseline. We don't know what is the baseline. What is the zero socialization? We don't have that, right? Because even when you go back to hunter-gatherer societies, like depending on the types of resources that they had available and all of this stuff, they're also going to have different social norms. So
we do observe that like 2-year-olds, like infant males, like tend to have like already act differently than like 2-year-old females do. So that does already suggest that like a lot of this is biological.
No. So I'm not. So I guess I'm trying to make a slightly different point, which is like, you can say that there are biological differences because you can observe similar patterns across basically all human societies, right? So there's not any human society that I know of where the women were primarily the war-going group and the men were primarily taking care of the kids. You're not going to find examples of that. So you can definitely see differences. But what I'm saying is like, are we making men more or less aggressive? Like, assuming there's a difference between men and women, are we making men more or less aggressive than they would be naturally? Well, what is naturally? Like, there's always a socialization there. So even if we can have very clear ways of seeing that there are biological differences, we can, do experiments like those done with girls that have CAH, which is a condition where they get bathed in androgens in the womb. And there's study after study which shows they end up having more male typical play patterns as kids, despite looking and being socialized as girls. So there's lots of careful ways that you can basically prove that there are sexual biological differences, on top of the fact that our prior should be that there are psychological differences between the sexes, just because we know about reproduction. But I also still think that it's important to say that like, what is the natural level of male aggression is not something that can be answered either, because every society is, socializing that to some extent. I think I missed we were talking about the prison stuff. So yes, I do agree with you that people on the left talk about socialization with respect to crime a lot, and they may even, talk about the gender component of that, but they don't actually, it doesn't lead to any conclusion where we should treat men differently than women for the same action. At the end of the day, we see the justice system as something that needs to protect people, needs to incentivize certain behaviors and disincentivize certain behaviors. And if the behaviors that we want to disincentivize are more common among males, that is what it is. And we're not going to attempt to, create equal representation there. So I guess that's what I'm getting at, where I do think that we don't mind kind of like saying it's men's fault that they're too risk-taking and they have more gambling addictions or whatever. But then we don't say, oh, therefore we should expect that there are also more male entrepreneurs, et cetera, than there are female entrepreneurs. And that doesn't speak to obvious signs of discrimination in and of itself, unless you have some other evidence that that's going on.
Yeah, okay. I guess that motivates me to want to open yet another can of worms. So you're talking about how like men are more likely to commit crimes and they're also more likely to be entrepreneurs. Do you subscribe to like the male variability hypothesis, and also explain to the audience what that is?
Male variability hypothesis is the idea that there's more sort of like male losers and there's more male winners, or more idiots and more geniuses, whatever way you want to say it. So, most people agree that IQs are pretty similar among men and women, very, very close at the mean, but you see men much more likely to be like outliers in various fields. Do I just sort of subscribe specifically to male variability? I am not sure how strong the evidence is for that in particular, but the thing is I don't think you needed to explain halo effects anyway. So if you assume that, first of all, genius is not just about having a high IQ in terms of like being a genius who did something that changed the world. Typically, you have a bunch of other important characteristics that you're like a 10 out of 10 on, in addition to being super high IQ. So it might be that you're obsessive. It might be that you are willing to totally disregard personal familial relationships and put those completely aside and just focus on your work. There's various things that go along with like these kind of people that perform in this way. Could be like, you're more willing to take risk, other things like that. So even without assuming that male IQ is more variable, just the fact that there's these like average differences across various things, and then that there's average differences in like the components of intelligence, shape rotators versus word cells, to simplify it, you can get really strong tail effects simply through that. And then you also have the discussion around ability versus desire. So it could be the case that, there are plenty of women who could have started a big company, but they preferred to marry someone who started a big company and have kids and spend more time with their family. And I don't think it's fair to say like they've done the wrong thing if that's the case. Like if a woman prefers that or whatever, and if women who have those abilities are more likely to make choices that do not sort of maximize the social production that results from those abilities, that's another way that you could see these differences of the tails.
But don't you think
male variability may or may not be true. I just don't think it's necessary to kind of directionally explain what we tend to see.
Yeah, but maybe it's very easy for people on the right to use that to justify misogynistic rhetoric against women and say like it's fine for like women to not be CEOs because like their natural role is at the home.
I think it is fine for women to not be CEOs. Like I think it's fine for people to not be CEOs. This is the thing that I find interesting, and like this also speaks to sort of goes back a little bit to some of the feminist self-selection thing, but also just to people who self-select to writing about culture and careers and all. The people who are writing about this stuff, they're ambitious people who for them, their career is super, super important to them. I just think there's a huge group of people who seem to not realize that for the average person, their career is just something they do to make money from goals that are not related to the career. It's almost entirely instrumental for many, many people. It's not a source of fulfillment for everyone. And so women who really want to be CEOs and have the ability should not be prevented from rising to that by like on the basis of them being women. But
they should not face the misogyny and harassment and discrimination that many women often face when trying to climb up the ranks.
right, exactly. And like so much of this is generational. I mean, I'm not saying misogyny doesn't exist now at all, but when you think about like these like big tech companies and stuff, I just don't think you're facing misogyny as a woman in them in a meaningful way. I mean, my experience in the workforce, at least, which is just one person's experience, obviously, if anything, my gender has been a plus, not a negative, if anything, or it's been neutral. That being said, I've heard from women who are, in their 70s now, who were in New York finance back in the 70s and 80s. Their stories are really inspiring, but they don't cause me to. So I find there's this very interesting stolen valor thing that you get with feminists, but with kinds of all different kind of identity politics type stuff, where when I hear from older women in my industry about the harassment that they faced when they were coming up in finance, I feel so much gratitude towards them, but I don't feel identification with them. So I think that it's a lot of people want to identify and then find threads from those women's experiences that are like weekly present in their own, and then claim that they have a common oppression with these women, when in fact, we are the beneficiaries of all this work that they did for us. And we should be grateful to them and recognizing the progress that's been made, rather than, trying to see this like never ending struggle that goes nowhere and claim that that's what's going on, when it's not. That being said, I'm sure there's plenty of industries and stuff where women are discriminated against. I just don't think it's finance and tech, which are the ones that get a lot of attention in terms of women being underrepresented. One of the things that, to be totally honest about this, is that a lot of women choose to drop out of the labor market. So a lot of the women who would have been in finance and tech, they are well off, and their partner and them both make significant amounts of money where they don't need two incomes. And when they get to the kid having stage, they might choose to focus on that because they just don't want to be so busy. It's not that they're like necessarily giving up their dream career. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes people really do give up their dream career and regret it. I just think that there's a lot more complexity here, and the assumption should not be, absent any evidence in support of it, that the reason you're seeing few women Fortune 500 CEOs is because they're being discriminated against. That might be part of it. It might be also cohorts that are still moving through various pipelines, but also most people would absolutely hate being a Fortune 500 company CEO. It's a terrible life for most people. Like, it's not a normal psychological thing, So anyway, it's not that you'd never want to take into account representation as one piece of information when you're thinking about evidence of gender discrimination and sexism. It's one relevant piece of information, but it on its own needs to be paired with other sources of inference for why you think sexism is happening. And simply saying at the very, 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 very top level, where 0.001% of men get there, there's only 0.0001% of women are getting there. That does not on its own tell you that there's discrimination. And I think there's also this very strong assumption that one of the most important goals, one of the most important things for women's well-being is that there be more of them as Fortune 500 company CEOs. And it's like, this is just not the concern of most women. This is not the thing in society that is harmful to most women. This is talking about an incredibly rarefied group of people in general, regardless of gender.
Would you at least accept the premise that maybe 10 years ago, or slightly longer, just any time before Me Too kicked in, would you accept the premise that a lot of the arguments that you're using about biological differences might often be used as a way to justify patriarchy and justify not looking at things like misogyny or workplace harassment?
Yes. So, I mean, the Me Too stuff, yeah, I don't think I think that I've actually struggled with this because I do tend to be more biased towards sort of like libertarian views. And I care a lot about free speech and freedom of association. And the reality is that a lot of sex discrimination law is preventing, to some degree, freedom of association. It's saying that you don't have the freedom to choose to associate with people on the basis of this set of characteristics. You have to ignore them with respect to employment, and you have to make sure that they don't affect how you treat people. I think that that was necessary for women to prove themselves in the workplace. So I think that the beliefs around how big sex differences were and how much variance there was among each sex were giving people license to exclude women who were more than qualified and appropriate for those jobs.
And maybe it also gave people an excuse to use language that perpetuated rape culture.
Yeah, I mean, I do think language matters. As much as people make fun of this stuff, I don't allow people to use the word bitch in my presence. I think it's like not okay. So like I can be, there are definitely places where I am more extreme than like the average person. And I do think this stuff matters. I don't think you should call people dicks or pussies. I don't think you should use this kind of language that, is essentially an insult on the basis of saying you're the worst thing that's associated with your sex. I think that kind of stuff is negative. But at the same time, I also think that way of thinking has been taken to an extreme where, okay, so let me think about what I'm trying to say here. I don't think that you should use sexist language. That does not mean that every single company, institution, club, etc., has to have norms and ways of communicating that are equally likely to be preferred by members of either sex. So, for example, I have a meetup group, and it
is this kind of like how like men support nuclear power more than women in reality. My guess is just that like neither gender has actually thought about it that much, and they're just trying to answer a survey.
That's true. But I'm also getting at sort of like ways of communicating and, thinking about, people complain about the feminization of the workplace, for example. Now, what are they saying when they're talking about feminization of the workplace? They're talking about changing the norms in a way that is more attractive to the average woman than it is to the average man. I don't think that norms in a workplace have to be equally likely to be preferred by members of either gender. So, for example...
And that would be impossible to do in practice.
It would be impossible to do in practice anyway, because you're never going to find that, like, sweet spot. And the reality is, like, different organizations have different cultures and characters, and they attract people on those bases. So, like, the stupid example I was going to give is I run this meetup group, or I used to. I haven't been running it the last couple of months, but... we would essentially like debate some podcast or whatever. We'd listen to the same podcast, we'd come together, we'd debate it, and we'd get drinks after. It's super fun. But I was, running this group, and I'm the one who gets to decide the norms because it's my group. And I was like, listen, this is not democratic, where I'm not trying to appeal to everybody. I'm trying to find a specific type of person I want to talk about these issues with. So the norms of my group are pretty aggressive. People have to interrupt to talk. Like, not everybody gets equal airtime, like, things like that. And I've moderated that a little bit over time. And I try to ask people, like, when there's a silent moment, did anybody want to say something that they didn't get to put in before, etc. But the reality is the types of norms that I have are more preferable to the average man, but they're not even preferable to the average man. It's like they're preferable to like 2% of men and only 0.5% of women or something. Most men and women hate the norms I have. It's fine. But those are the norms I have. And I think like when it comes to the culture in a workplace, you should also have free reign around that. So if you're a nonprofit that's staffed by all women and you do everything around consensus decision-making, making sure everyone gets heard, hand raising, whatever, that's perfectly fine. And if those norms are off-putting to men, then men are going to be less likely to join the organization. And if you want more men to join your organization, then you might consider changing the norms and vice versa. But in and of itself, norms that are unattractive to members of a particular sex is not a sin in any way to me.
And you're saying like it's not inherently sexist to do so.
No, it's not. It's not. And like, even when we think about tech, it's like, when we're talking about people who are programmers at Amazon, these are just like really smart people who are really good at, especially back in the early days when this was a smaller company. It's like, those people are really, really atypical. Whatever norms are going to serve that group of people are probably going to be off-putting to the average American off the street. So that's okay. And it's like, if those norms are slightly more preferable to the average man than the average woman, it's kind of irrelevant because we're talking about such a small slice of people, and we're talking about serving a very particular goal which needs a very particular type of person with very particular skills, which happen to overlap with all these personality characteristics and other things, which then should naturally, through like the leadership and through the people that are part of the organization, create the norms that make sense for them. So I don't know if that made sense, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I do think language matters. I do really appreciate the women who were strong enough to sort of like push through dealing with harassment and sexism and open discrimination to prove that they could do what they could do, to, normalize the fact that even if we believe in average sex differences, there's so much heterogeneity. There's all different types of women and all different types of men. I think that is all great, but we don't need to take that so far to say like, we need to make sure that we're extremely welcoming to some random woman that is not even the type of woman who would ever want to work here.
Is your Substack audience like disproportionately male?
I don't know. I think so. I think it probably is. I mean, a lot of them are anons, so you can only assume based on
like the fake names they have.
Yeah, based on the fake names and like the style of writing and stuff. But I would assume it's disproportionately male. I definitely engage with a lot of women on Substack, but I think that I would assume Substack is disproportionately male, first of all. And then I think that the slant that I take, which I think is quite gender neutral, is probably more popular with a male audience. And I am trying to speak to both audiences. I actually like, in terms of the purpose of writing, I don't know which goal is easier to achieve. Talking to reasonable women and convincing them that the evidence for sex differences is probably stronger than they think, and that might be relevant to their views on a couple of things, or convincing men who are like about to go the red-pilled alpha bro route that, actually it's really not necessary, and you're making your own relationships with women in the future harder. And feminism does not hate men in general, even though there's a lot of people who say, even though there's a lot of people who say I'm a feminist, like, and then spew misandrous stuff primarily, which bothers me. But I mean, and it's like, I'm also not the person who gets to decide who is and who is not a feminist. I'm just a random person writing online, of course. But I think that, to me, if you are primarily producing sexist content, whether it's against men or against women, it's very, very hard for me to see how you are a feminist.
Regan Arntz-Gray, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation. I know we went a lot of places, and hopefully I'll, be able to develop this into some blog posts in the future.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.